Schools across the country are still reeling from the consequences of COVID-19. The Nebraska Department of Education just released data from a statewide assessment taken last spring.
State Commissioner Matthew Blomstedt gave us a snapshot of education in Nebraska, where it is and where it needs to go. There was an increase in the number of schools that, quote, need support to improve, but there was also an increase in the number of schools the department classified as excellent. The agency makes those classifications based on primarily assessment scores.
Blomstedt says historically marginalized students had a harder time during the pandemic. Assessment data shows only 30% of students who qualified for free and reduced lunches were proficient in English, 17 points lower than the state average of 47%.
There's going to be years of impacts that we're going to have to unpack and unfold. There's challenges that we were facing when we were moving to safe environments, or what we thought would be safe environments in the midst of the pandemic, but moving and disrupting the education of our students.
Another big issue, attendance. The department finding there were 77,000 chronically absent students in the school year 2021 to 22, nearly double the previous year's total.